The Alaska deal, Trump sacrifices Ukraine to isolate China. Let's unpack a geopolitical thought experiment. A summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage set the stage for a radical new strategy. A strategy that could trade Ukrainian security for a chance to reshape the world order. This is the story of the idea behind the Alaska deal, a gamble to drive a wedge between Russia and China, and why Europe might be the one to pay the price. On paper, the August 2025 summit at Joint Base Ilmendorf-Richardson was about one thing: ending the war in Ukraine. For the first time in years, Vladimir Putin was on US soil. He was met with a formal welcome, which included a red carpet and a military flyover, a powerful piece of optics for Moscow that was broadcast across the world. Choreographed handshakes, a different reality emerged. The talks wrapped up in under 3 hours, much shorter than originally planned. And most importantly, no deal was reached. There was no ceasefire. In fact, as the two leaders met, Russian forces continued their attacks across Ukraine. In his public remarks, Trump acknowledged the outcome, stating, "We didn't get there, and there's no deal until there's a deal," a subdued admission that the summit's main goal had failed. So if no treaty was signed and the war raged on, what was the real point of the Anchorage meeting? To understand that, you have to look beyond the immediate headlines and focus on the one player who wasn't in the room, but whose shadow loomed over everything: China. The Alaska summit appears to be less about achieving peace in Ukraine and more about signaling a seismic shift in American grand strategy. For the Trump administration, the thinking goes, the war in Europe is a costly distraction. The primary long-term threat to American dominance is in Beijing. This has given rise to a strategy openly debated in foreign policy circles: the reverse Nixon. In 1972, President Richard Nixon famously went to China to exploit the Sino-Soviet split and isolate the USSR. The thinking now is to flip that script, pull Russia away from China to isolate Beijing. The logic is simple. A unified Russia-China axis creates a Eurasian superpower with the economic and military might to challenge the United States globally. But a Russia that is neutralized, but they require a choice. A choice between China and a deal with the West. Why would Vladimir Putin, who has staked his legacy on confronting NATO, even entertain this? Because after years of grinding warfare, Russia is feeling the strain. The no-limits partnership with China has become an economic lifeline, but it comes at the cost of sovereignty. Russia is increasingly dependent on Chinese technology and markets, a dynamic that Moscow has historically been uncomfortable with. The Alaska summit offered Putin a few things he needs. First, legitimacy. The red carpet welcome was a PR coup, portraying him not as a pariah, but as a global statesman. Second, it signaled a shift from the US away from demanding a ceasefire before a final settlement, a long-standing Russian objective. And third, it presented the prospect of sanctions relief without having to fully surrender his war aims. While no final deal was made, subsequent reports and analyses have sketched out the contours of what was likely discussed. It has been reported that Putin demanded full control over Ukraine's Donbas region in exchange for freezing the current front lines elsewhere. He would get to keep territory, declare a form of victory, and break out of his international isolation. For a leader in that position, the offer to trade a dependent relationship with China for a pragmatic settlement with a transactional American president is a powerful incentive. Before we dig into the immense risks of this strategy, if you find this kind of analysis valuable, take a second to subscribe. We connect the dots behind the headlines like this every week. This grand strategic pivot, however, comes at an enormous price, a price to be paid almost entirely by Ukraine and Europe. For Ukraine, the implications are devastating. Even though Trump publicly stated that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has to agree to any deal, the message from Alaska was clear: the United States is willing to entertain the idea of territorial concessions. A European official familiar with the post-summit discussions reportedly confirmed that Trump was supportive of a plan where Ukraine would cede territory to secure peace. This is a fundamental betrayal of the principle that no decisions about Ukraine should be made without Ukraine. It puts Kyiv in an impossible position: either accept the dismemberment of their country or risk being abandoned by their most powerful ally. For Europe, the summit was a glimpse into a future where American security guarantees are no longer ironclad. The fact that the meeting happened without any European or Ukrainian leaders at the table underscored their potential marginalization in talks about their own continent's security. Trump's subsequent statement that European nations have to get involved a little bit could be interpreted less as an invitation and more as a warning that they will be left to handle their own security. This unilateral approach could force a crisis within NATO. It signals that America's commitment to collective defense could be conditional, potentially splintering the transatlantic alliance and forcing nations to accelerate their push for strategic autonomy. But what if this high-stakes gamble doesn't work? The entire strategy rests on a series of risky assumptions. First, it assumes Putin can be trusted or successfully managed. The Russian leader may simply be playing for time, taking the diplomatic prestige from the summit with no real intention of breaking with Beijing. Many in Europe fear this is less a reverse Nixon and more a new Yalta, where great powers carve up spheres of influence over the heads of smaller nations. Second, the plan may underestimate the depth of the Russia-China relationship. Theirs is not just an alliance of convenience, it is a partnership cemented by a shared goal of challenging the American-led world order. It's unlikely the US could or would replace China's role as Russia's economic lifeline. Finally, it assumes Europe will either fall in line or fracture. An alternative outcome is that this American pivot could backfire, uniting Europe against the United States. A strategically autonomous Europe could emerge as a third bloc, leaving America more isolated, not less. The foundation of US global power has been its network of alliances, and sacrificing that for a speculative deal with an adversary is a risk of historic proportions. The Alaska summit on 15 August did not end the war in Ukraine. But it did reveal a blueprint for a potential new American foreign policy. It showed a willingness to trade the security architecture of Europe for a perceived advantage in the long-term competition with China. It is a plan built on a foundation of immense risks, the risk of betraying an ally, fracturing the most successful military alliance in history, and misreading the intentions of both Russia and China. The summit may not have produced a treaty, but it posed a fundamental question to the world. Is the United States about to if this is the plan being debated, but whether it can possibly succeed and what the world will look like if it fails?